There is a voice in your head that is not yours. It has opinions about your ambition, whether it is too much or not enough. It has a position on your achievements, whether they are sufficient, whether they justify the space you take up, whether you have earned the right to want what you want. It comments on your failures with a specific quality of weight that your own self-criticism does not quite produce. And if you trace that voice back far enough, past the professional context where it speaks most loudly, past the relationships where it shapes what you allow yourself to ask for, past the moments of private reckoning where it determines whether what you did today was enough, you arrive almost always at the same source. Your father, or the absence of him, or whoever occupied inadequately or overwhelmingly or not at all, the psychological position that the father archetype requires someone to fill. Jung called the pattern that voice belongs to the father complex, and it is running more of your life than you know. Jung understood the father complex as one of the two foundational complexes of the human psyche, the other being the mother complex, which we examined in the previous video, where the mother complex organizes the psyche's relationship with containment, nourishment, and the experience of being held. The father complex organizes its relationship with authority, judgment, achievement, and the right to exist as a differentiated individual in the world. The father archetype is the principle of structure, of law of the logos, the word that names, defines, and orders. It is the first encounter with a force that is not only warm and containing, but demanding and evaluating. A force that says not only you are safe here, but you must become something. And the encounter between the child's psyche and the real father, with his presence or absence, his approval or withholding, his own unexamined relationship with authority and achievement, is the encounter that produces the complex. The counterintuitive truth that Jung's framework produces about the father complex is the same one it produces about the mother complex, and equally difficult to receive. The complex is not formed only by fathers who are obviously destructive. The cold father, the absent father, the violent father, these produce recognizable complexes with recognizable symptoms. But the over-invested father, the father whose approval was the organizing principle of the family system, the father who was himself so psychologically large that there was no room for the child to develop a self in his shadow, these produce complexes that are equally formative and far less often recognized as such. The father complex does not require a bad father. It requires an encounter between the archetypal expectation of the father and a human man who could not fulfill it completely, which is every father who has ever lived. This video is about the father complex in Jung's psychology, how it forms in men and in women differently, how it operates in the relationship with authority, ambition, and the right to one's own life, what the absent father and the overwhelming father each leave in the psyche, and what Jung understood about the work of differentiating from the father complex, the work that is not the rejection of the father, but the finding of oneself on the other side of him. The same distinction that structures the mother complex structures the father complex. The distinction between the archetypal father and the real father, between the psychological principle that the father position is meant to embody, and the human man who occupies it with varying degrees of adequacy. The father archetype in Jung's framework is the principle of the logos, of naming, ordering, differentiating, and judging. It is the psychic force that separates the child from the undifferentiated unity of the mother world and introduces the principle of structure, the idea that things have names, that actions have consequences, that the world has an order that can be learned and navigated, and that the individual has a specific position within that order that must be earned and maintained. The encounter with the father archetype is the encounter with the demand to become. The real father is the human man who is meant to embody this principle, and who does so with the inevitable incompleteness of a human being who has his own complex, his own unresolved relationship with authority, his own wounds from his own father, his own psychology that was not assembled with the child's developmental needs as its organizing priority. Every father transmits two things simultaneously: whatever he consciously intends to transmit, the values, the expectations, the love, the structure he believes he is offering, and whatever his own unconscious psychology transmits without his awareness or consent. The father complex is formed not only by what the father deliberately taught, but by what his presence communicated, what his absence implied, what his emotional unavailability or his overinvestment produced in the child's developing sense of what it means to be a self in the world. Picture a specific father, a man who is not cruel, not absent, not obviously destructive. He is present, he is invested, he loves his child in ways that are real and that the child knows are real. But he carries in his own psychology a specific relationship with achievement. Nothing is ever quite enough. Not as a stated philosophy, but as an emotional atmosphere, a subtle and consistent quality of evaluation that attaches itself to the child's accomplishments and finds always the gap between what was achieved and what could have been. The child who grows up in this atmosphere does not learn that they are inadequate. They learn something more insidious, that the right level of achievement, the achievement that would finally produce the uncomplicated approval they need, is always just slightly out of reach. And they carry this learning into every professional context, every relationship where evaluation is possible, every private moment of reckoning with what they have done with their life. The crucial distinction, the one that most content about the father complex either misses or understates, is that the father complex is not primarily about the father. It is about the internalized father, the psychic structure that formed in response to the real father, and that now operates independently of him. As an internal judge, an internal standard, an internal voice that evaluates and pronounces and withholds in patterns that were laid down in childhood and that have been running, largely unexamined, ever since. The real father may have changed, may have softened, may have developed, may be a different person at 70 than he was at 35. The internalized father does not automatically update. He remains in the psyche, the father he was when the complex was formed, unless the complex is worked with directly. The father complex in men has a specific gravity that comes from the fact that the son's relationship with the father is also inevitably a relationship with what he is expected to become. The father is not only the first authority, he is the first model of what a man is, what a man does, what a man is allowed to feel, how a man occupies space in the world. The son who grows up with an emotionally present, psychologically differentiated father has access to a model of masculinity that includes complexity, vulnerability, and genuine selfhood. The son who grows up with a father whose own psychology was constricted by his own father, by cultural expectations, by the specific limitations of the historical and cultural moment he inhabited, receives a more constricted model. And the son who grew up without a father receives something different again. Not a constricted model, but an absence around which he must construct, largely without external guidance, some relationship with the masculine principle. The most common manifestation of the father complex in men is what might be called the permanent audition, the experience of living as if still trying to earn the father's approval in contexts where the father is not present and where the evaluation that matters is no longer his. The man who works with a compulsiveness that his actual circumstances do not require, who cannot rest without the specific anxiety that not working produces, who measures his worth in achievements and finds always that the achieved never quite produces the settled sense of enoughness that the next achievement promises. This is not ambition in the healthy sense. It is the internalized father's evaluation system running on automatic long after the man has left the original context in which that system was installed. Picture a man in his late 30s, professionally successful by every external measure, having exceeded his father's achievements, who finds himself in moments of private reckoning, still measuring himself against his father's implicit standards, still hearing in the voice that comments on his work a specific quality that is not his own voice's quality, still organized, in ways he cannot fully explain, around a question that his achievements have not answered. Is this enough? Would this be enough? The success is real. The external validation is real. And neither of them touches the complex because the complex was not formed by external conditions and cannot be resolved by them. It was formed by an internalized structure that evaluates from inside. And that structure requires internal work, not external achievement, to change. There is a second and equally significant manifestation of the father complex in men that operates in the opposite direction. Not the compulsive achievement organized around winning the father's approval, but the compulsive rejection of achievement organized around refusing it. The man who cannot commit to professional ambition, who sabotages success when it arrives, who maintains a chronic underachievement that puzzles everyone who can see his actual capacity, is sometimes carrying a father complex, organized not around earning approval but around refusing to become the father. If the father's world, the world of conventional success, of professional achievement, of the values the father embodied, felt suffocating, constricting, or simply wrong, the son may have organized his entire psychology around not entering that world. The rebellion is real, and it is still organized around the father, still defined by him, still answering to him, just with a different answer. The father complex in women has received less attention in popular psychology than its manifestation in men, partly because the cultural narrative about fathers and daughters has tended toward either sentimentality or the specific damage of absent or abusive fathers, and partly because the Jungian framework's concept of the animus, the masculine dimension of the female psyche, adds a layer of complexity that is genuinely difficult to communicate accessibly. But the father complex in women is no less formative than in men, and in some respects it is more far-reaching, because it shapes not only the woman's relationship with external authority and achievement, but her relationship with her own thinking, her own authority, and her own right to take up intellectual and professional space in the world. Jung connected the father complex in women to the development of the animus, the internal masculine principle that, when the father complex is unexamined, remains fused with the father's image, rather than developing into a differentiated relationship with the woman's own authority, her own logos, her own capacity for judgment and decision. The woman with a strong, positive father complex, formed by a father who was genuinely present, who took her seriously as a thinking and feeling person, who offered both warmth and structure, has access to an internalized masculine principle that supports her own authority, rather than undermining it. The woman with a negative or absent father complex carries a different internal masculine, one that may criticize rather than support, that may undermine rather than authorize, that may produce the specific self-doubt of a woman who cannot access her own authority, because the internal masculine voice is organized around judgment rather than support. Picture a woman in her early 40s who has spent her professional life consistently undervaluing her own contributions, who presents her ideas tentatively, who qualifies her statements before others can question them, who has developed a sophisticated system of preemptive self-diminishment that she experiences as modesty, but that operates as a kind of internal veto on her own authority. When she traces this pattern back, she arrives at a father who was not cruel, who was, in many respects, warm and loving, but whose specific way of engaging with her ideas was always slightly corrective, always finding the gap, always positioning himself as the authority and her as the student, in a way that communicated, consistently and without explicit statement, that her thinking required his validation before it could be taken seriously. The internal voice that now performs this function, that finds the gap, that positions itself as the authority, that requires external validation before it can authorize her own, is not her voice. It is the father complex running on automatic. There is a third manifestation of the father complex in women that is worth naming separately. The woman for whom the father was idealized rather than adequately present. The absent father, the father who died, the father who was physically present but emotionally so distant as to be functionally absent. These produce a specific form of the complex organized around an idealization that has never been tested by the ordinary friction of real relationship. The idealized father becomes, in the woman's psychology, a standard against which all subsequent men are measured and found wanting. Here is what this looks like in a specific life. A woman in her late 30s who has had several relationships with men she initially experienced as extraordinary, unusually intelligent, unusually present, unusually capable of the depth she was seeking. Each relationship began with a quality of recognition that felt almost destined, and each one ended at approximately the same point when the man revealed himself to be ordinarily human, when he was tired or wrong about something, or simply less than the initial impression had suggested. The disappointment was not proportionate to the revelation. It was total. What she was measuring each man against was not a previous partner. It was the father who was never present enough to be ordinary, who remained because he was never fully known, a luminous impossibility that no real man could survive comparison with. As with the mother complex, the father complex organizes itself most recognizably around two poles, the absent father and the overwhelming father, each of which leaves a specific and identifiable mark on the psyche of the child who encounters them. The absent father, whether through death, abandonment, divorce, or the more common emotional absence of a man who is physically present but psychologically unavailable, produces a complex organized around the missing principle. The principle of authority, structure, and the logos that the father is meant to embody is not transmitted, and the child must construct some relationship with that principle largely without external guidance, often in ways that are more extreme than would have been necessary if a real relationship with a real, differentiated father had been possible. The absent father produces a specific hunger, not for the individual man who was not there, but for the principle he was meant to embody. This hunger expresses itself in the consistent search for father figures in adulthood, the mentor whose approval reorganizes the professional self-image, the authority figure whose recognition produces a quality of satisfaction that ordinary achievement does not, the teacher, the boss, the older colleague whose regard is felt as more consequential than the regard of peers. This search is not pathological. It is the psyche's legitimate attempt to find in the external world what was not available in the original family system. But the search organized around an unexamined complex tends to reproduce the original dynamics. The father figure is idealized, the relationship becomes organized around approval, and when the inevitable disappointment comes, when the father figure proves to be human rather than archetypal, the collapse produces a specific grief that is disproportionate to the external loss. The overwhelming father, the father who was psychologically so large, so dominant, so completely the organizing principle of the family system, that there was insufficient room for the child to develop a differentiated self in his presence, produces a complex of different structure. Where the absent father produces hunger, the overwhelming father produces something more like suffocation, the specific difficulty of developing an identity that is genuinely one's own in the presence of a force that has already claimed the space identity requires. The child of the overwhelming father learns in the most fundamental way possible that having a self, a perspective, a desire, a judgment that differs from the father's is dangerous. And the adult who carries this complex has correspondingly a specific difficulty with authority, either a chronic deference that disguises itself as reasonableness, or a chronic rebellion that disguises itself as independence, but is still defined, in its structure, by the father it is rejecting. The specific scene that the overwhelming father complex produces in adult life is recognizable and rarely named as what it is. A person in a meeting with a powerful authority figure, a senior colleague, a board member, an investor, who finds that something in them goes quiet, not out of strategic calculation, something more automatic than that. The perspective they had before entering the room, clear, well-reasoned, genuinely theirs, becomes somehow less certain in the presence of the authority. The words come out more tentatively than they were formed. The position is qualified before it is questioned. And afterward, alone, the person knows that what they said was not quite what they thought, that something in the presence of the authority reorganized their relationship to their own judgment in a way they could not prevent and cannot entirely explain. That is the overwhelming father complex operating in the present. The meeting was with the authority figure. The complex was with the father. The father complex's most consistent and most consequential operating territory in adult life is the relationship with authority, with institutions, with hierarchies, with the people who occupy positions of power and evaluation in professional and social contexts. Because the father is the first authority, the first encounter with a force that evaluates, that sets standards, that grants or withholds the approval that shapes the child's developing sense of whether they are adequate. The father complex installs the template through which all subsequent authority is experienced. The boss is not simply the boss. The institution is not simply the institution. They carry, for the person with an unexamined father complex, the emotional weight of the original authority, which means they are capable of producing responses that belong to a much earlier and much more consequential relationship. The two most recognizable manifestations of the father complex in the relationship with authority are chronic deference and chronic rebellion, two positions that appear opposite but are structurally identical in that both are organized around the father rather than around the person's own genuine relationship with the authority in question. The chronically deferential person cannot access their own judgment in the presence of authority, not because they lack judgment, but because the father complex produces, automatically and preconsciously, the experience that their judgment requires external authorization before it can be trusted. The chronically rebellious person cannot assess authority on its merits, cannot find what is genuinely valuable in a structure or a hierarchy, because the father complex produces, with equal automatism, the experience that authority is by definition something to be resisted. There is a third manifestation that is subtler and more psychologically interesting than either deference or rebellion, what might be called a compulsive authority. The person who, in response to the father complex, has organized their entire professional and personal life around becoming the authority rather than relating to it. The person who cannot be in a subordinate position without intolerable anxiety, who must be the expert, the leader, the person whose judgment others defer to, not primarily because of genuine confidence, but because the position of non-authority activates the complex in ways that are unbearable. This person has found a solution to the father complex that works professionally. Being the authority means never having to be evaluated by one, but at the cost of a specific isolation, because genuine peer relationships require the capacity to be equal, which requires the capacity to be neither the authority nor the subordinate, which the unexamined complex makes very difficult. Picture the specific texture of a professional life organized around the father complex without the person knowing it. A woman who has built a successful career, who is genuinely competent and genuinely respected, and who finds that the professional contexts she finds most intolerable are the ones that involve evaluation by senior figures, not because she performs poorly in them, but because something in her goes into a mode that she experiences as professional anxiety, but that has the specific quality of a much older fear. The preparation for these contexts is excessive relative to what the situation requires. The recovery from them is longer than the situation justifies, and the relief when they produce approval has a quality that is different from the ordinary satisfaction of professional success. It is deeper, more physical, more like the relief of something fundamental having been momentarily resolved than like the pleasure of a task accomplished. The evaluation was professional. The relief was the complex. Differentiating from the father complex, which is the Jungian term for the work of this chapter, is not the same as rejecting the father, transcending the father, or severing the psychological connection with the father. It is the work of developing a relationship with the father that is no longer organized entirely by the complex, that can include the real father, with his humanity and his limitations, rather than only the internalized image that the complex constructed. And it is the work of developing a relationship with authority, with judgment, with the right to one's own perspective, that is no longer filtered through the complex's automatic evaluation system. The goal is not the absence of the father's influence. It is the presence of a self that can be influenced without being organized by the influence. The first movement of differentiation is the recognition of the complex's signature, the capacity to notice in present situations when the father complex is operating. This requires the same willingness to observe disproportionate responses that the work of the mother complex required. The recognition that when the response is larger than the present situation justifies, something from the past is being activated. The professional anxiety that is excessive relative to the actual stakes. The relief from approval that is deeper than the situation warrants. The paralysis in the presence of authority that cannot be explained by the authority's actual power. Each of these is the complex's signature, and naming them, even privately, is the beginning of developing the gap between the automatic response and the conscious self that makes choice possible. The second movement is what Jung called the confrontation with the father image. The internal work of examining the internalized father directly, of bringing into consciousness the specific demands, judgments, and standards that the complex installed, and of evaluating them with the adult self rather than accepting them with the child self that originally received them. Here is what this confrontation looks like in a specific moment. A man in his mid-40s, alone after a day in which he achieved something genuinely significant, something that would, by any external measure, qualify as success, finds the familiar voice arriving with its familiar verdict. It is not enough, not yet, not quite what was required. And this time, instead of accepting the verdict and converting it into motivation for the next achievement, he stops. He asks for the first time with genuine curiosity, rather than with the anxiety of someone who fears the answer. Whose standard is this? When was this standard set? Was I there when it was set, or was it installed before I had the capacity to evaluate it? The confrontation is not the destruction of the internal father. It is the first moment in which the adult self refuses to receive the verdict without examining the judge. And that refusal, however small and however incomplete, is the beginning of differentiation. The third movement is the finding of what Jung called the symbolic father, the internalization of a relationship with the father principle that is no longer dependent on the real father's adequacy or inadequacy. The symbolic father is the adult's own developed relationship with structure, with authority, with the logos, a relationship that has been built through experience, through the testing of one's own judgment against reality, through the accumulation of evidence that one's own perspective has value and does not require external authorization to be trusted. This is the destination of the differentiation work, not the elimination of the father's influence, but the development of an internal authority that is genuinely one's own, that can acknowledge what the father contributed without being governed by what the father installed. And it is from that internal authority, imperfect, still developing, never finally complete, that the quality described in the next chapter becomes possible. There is a specific quality that emerges when the father complex begins to be genuinely integrated, a quality that is different from the confidence that comes from external achievement and different from the defiance that comes from rejecting authority. It is the quality of internal authorization, the experience of being able to access one's own judgment, one's own perspective, one's own sense of what is right and what is enough, without needing to route that access through an external approval system or through the internalized father's evaluation. This quality is not loudness. It is not the performance of authority. It is something quieter, the specific settledness of a person who has found somewhere inside themselves a voice that is genuinely theirs and that they have learned to trust. Jung described the goal of individuation not as freedom from influence, which is impossible and would not be desirable even if it were possible, but as the development of a self that can be genuinely influenced without being governed by the influence. The person who has done genuine work with the father complex does not become someone for whom authority is irrelevant, for whom the judgment of others carries no weight, for whom the father's world and the father's values have nothing to offer. They become someone who can engage with authority from a position of genuine selfhood, who can take what is valuable from the father's world without being organized by it, who can disagree without needing the disagreement to define them, who can achieve without the achievement being primarily about resolving the complex. The work of differentiating from the father complex is, ultimately, the work of becoming, in Jung's phrase, one's own father, of developing the internal capacity to offer oneself the structure, the authorization, the judgment that the real father could not offer completely, and that the internalized father has been offering in distorted form. This is not a metaphor for self-sufficiency or for the rejection of external relationship. It is the description of an internal development, the development of a relationship with the father principle inside oneself that is no longer organized around the wound the real father left, but around the genuine self's own authority over its own life. The voice in your head that has been pronouncing on your achievements and your failures and your right to want what you want, that voice can change, not by being silenced, by being answered, by the self that has been listening to it for decades finally having enough of its own authority to say, quietly and without drama, I hear you, and I have a different view. If you arrived at this video carrying some version of the voice described at the beginning, the voice that comments on your ambition, that evaluates your achievements, that determines whether what you did today was enough, then what this video offers is not a technique for silencing it. It is an invitation to examine it, to ask whose voice it actually is, to notice where it came from and what it was responding to, and whether the standards it applies are standards you would choose if you were choosing freely. The father complex is not your enemy. It is a structure that formed in response to a real encounter with a real man who was doing his best in the specific conditions of his specific life. It served you, and it is now, in the ways this video has tried to name, no longer serving you in the same way. The work of differentiation is the work of thanking it for what it built and building, from here, something more genuinely your own.